Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving deep into Alberta agriculture.
Sounds fascinating.
You've given me this really interesting collection of sources, like reports and infographics.
Oh, yeah.
Even some advice for, people who want to become farmers.
Cool!
There's like a crash course in everything you need to know about farming in Alberta.
From the ground up.
Yeah, from soil science to the business side of things.
Economics, yeah.
I was really surprised by just how important Alberta is to agriculture in Canada.
Oh.
One of the infographics you gave me shows that in 2016, Alberta had the second highest number of farms in all of Canada.
Wow. That's impressive.
21%, to be exact.
That's a significant chunk.
It is. But, I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what officially makes something a farm. I always thought it was just like crops and fields.
Right.
But one source mentioned Christmas trees and maple syrup, too.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's actually a lot of diversity in what counts as a farm. Officially, Statistics Canada defines a census farm as any operation that produces agricultural products for sale.
Oh, okay.
So that includes crops and livestock, obviously.
Makes sense.
But also things like Christmas trees, maple syrup, greenhouse products, and a bunch of other stuff.
Huh. More variety than I would have thought.
Definitely.
Looking at the infographic, though, it seems like beef cattle are the most common type of farm in Alberta,
Right.
followed by oilseed and grain farming.
Yeah. Which makes sense.
Because of the prairies.
Oh, exactly. Alberta's vast prairies are perfect for growing grain,
Yeah,
and the province has a long history of ranching.
true. It's interesting how, geography and history kind of shape the agricultural landscape.
They really do. It's all connected.
One thing that really jumped out at me from these sources was how much emphasis there is on soil health.
Oh, absolutely.
One source even compared soil testing to getting a blood test, but for your field.
It's a good analogy.
So it's not just about planting seeds and hoping for the best.
Nope, not at all. Soil is the foundation of everything in agriculture.
Right.
And understanding its health is crucial for sustainable farming. Testing the soil gives farmers valuable data
Data on what?
on nutrient levels. Things like nitrogen and phosphorus.
Okay.
And that allows them to apply fertilizer in a precise way.
So they're not just, dumping fertilizer everywhere.
Exactly. Over-fertilizing can be really bad for the environment.
And the sources you gave me really stress that it's bad for farmers' wallets, too.
Sure.
Why waste money on fertilizer if your crops don't actually need it?
Exactly. It's about being efficient. And it's about stewardship, too.
How so?
Well, when you over-apply fertilizer, a lot of those nutrients can end up running off into water sources.
Polluting them.
Exactly. It can pollute rivers and lakes.
That's no good.
So this data-driven approach with soil testing helps farmers find that sweet spot.
That balance between giving the crops what they need and not overdoing it.
Precisely. And speaking of data, I was fascinated by all the different methods for sampling soil.
Oh, yeah, there are a lot.
Like whole field composite sampling, landscape directed sampling.
Benchmark sampling. There was even something called grid sampling.
Yeah, grid sampling.
That sounds high-tech.
It is. Some methods are more high-tech than others, and obviously some are more expensive.
And I guess the choice of method depends on what the farmer's trying to achieve.
Exactly. It depends on the field itself, how much variability there is in the soil,
Makes sense.
and also on how precise the farmer needs to be with their fertilizer application.
So it's not just sticking a shovel in the ground anymore.
Nope. Farmers today have access to some pretty amazing tools and technologies.
Yeah, this really highlights how technology is changing agriculture.
Absolutely.
Now let's move on to tilling, which is a topic I hadn't really thought much about before looking at these sources.
Right.
I guess most people just imagine tilling as, plowing a field.
Yeah, kind of a simple image.
But it's obviously more complicated than that.
It is. The source you gave me explains how conventional tilling, with all those passes over the field, can actually have some negative side effects.
Yeah, one source described how it can speed up decomposition in the soil,
Right.
which then leads to soil compaction and a higher risk of erosion.
Exactly. So it can actually damage the soil in the long run.
It's almost like you're beating up the soil instead of taking care of it.
That's a good way to put it. That's why more and more farmers are turning to conservation tillage methods,
Like what?
like direct seeding and zero tillage,
Okay.
where you minimize the disturbance to the soil.
So instead of turning over the whole field,
You just create a narrow seed bed.
and you leave the residue from the previous crop on the surface.
Exactly.
Less work for the farmer and better for the soil.
It's a win-win.
It sounds like it. But wouldn't all that leftover stubble cause problems?
Like what?
Wouldn't it make it harder for the new seeds to sprout?
You'd think so, right? But it actually has some benefits.
Like what?
Well, the stubble acts like a natural mulch.
Okay.
It traps snow during the winter, which provides moisture in the spring,
Okay.
and it helps to prevent erosion.
So it's like a natural weed barrier, too.
It can be, yeah. It helps to suppress weeds.
Wow, nature is pretty smart.
It is. But of course, there will always be some weeds that manage to sneak through.
And then you have to use herbicides.
Sometimes, yeah.
But there are other options, right?
Right. The sources you gave me really emphasize integrated pest management.
IPM.
Yep. It's a more holistic approach to pest control.
So it's not just about spraying chemicals.
Nope. It involves using a combination of methods to control pests.
Like what?
Well, it starts with things like choosing pest-resistant crop varieties
Oh.
and disrupting pest life cycles through crop rotation, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
And then there's monitoring pest populations.
To see how bad they are.
Exactly. And only taking action, like spraying, if the pest population reaches a certain threshold.
So it's about being strategic.
Exactly. It's about understanding the ecosystem and recognizing that some pests are going to be there no matter what you do.
And just trying to keep them under control.
Precisely.
It seems like sustainability in agriculture is all about finding that balance, isn't it?
It really is.
Balance between managing pests and minimizing the impact on the environment.
Exactly. And this theme of balance keeps coming up over and over again in these sources.
Speaking of balance, the next topic we should look at is crop rotation. I've always wondered why farmers don't just plant the same thing year after year if it's working.
That's a good question. It seems logical, right?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
But it turns out that planting the same crop in the same field over and over again, what we call monoculture, can actually be really bad for the soil.
In what way?
Well, it can deplete the soil of certain nutrients,
Oh, okay.
and it makes the crops more susceptible to pests and diseases that target that specific crop.
So it's like if you only eat one type of food all the time, you're not going to be very healthy.
Exactly. Variety is important for a healthy diet, and it's important for a healthy farm ecosystem, too.
That makes sense. What are some examples of crop rotations that farmers use in Alberta?
Well, a classic example is alternating between cereals like wheat or barley and broad-leaved crops like canola or peas.
Okay.
That helps to break the cycles of pests and diseases.
Right.
And it diversifies the nutrients that are being taken up from the soil.
So different crops need different nutrients.
Exactly. And I noticed that one of the sources mentioned fall-seeded crops.
Yeah, what's the deal with those?
Well, it's not just about spreading out the workload.
Oh.
Fall-seeded crops like winter wheat offer some real advantages.
Like what?
They can make better use of the moisture that's available in the early spring,
Okay.
which is especially important in drier parts of the province.
True.
And they also act as a cover crop over the winter, which helps to protect the soil from erosion.
It's like they're doing double duty.
Exactly. And speaking of cover crops, there's also something called green manuring, which sounds pretty fancy.
It does.
It's basically like a spa treatment for your field.
Okay. How so?
Well, it involves growing a crop specifically to improve the soil health. And legumes, like peas or clover, are often used for this purpose.
Because they add nitrogen to the soil.
Right, exactly. They fix nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form that plants can use.
So it's a natural fertilizer.
Exactly.
Pretty cool how nature can do that.
It is.
It seems like sustainable agriculture is really all about working with these natural processes instead of trying to fight against them.
Exactly.
We've covered a lot of ground already, from the
Yeah.
importance of soil health to the ins and outs of tilling and crop rotation.
We have.
It's amazing how much thought and strategy goes into something that seems as simple as growing food.
It's a lot more complex than people realize, and we're just getting started. Next, we need to delve into the topic of pest management
Okay.
and explore the role of pesticides in modern agriculture.
This is where things can get a little controversial, right?
They can.
Some people view pesticides as a necessary evil,
Right.
while others want to ban them completely.
Yeah, there are strong opinions on both sides.
The sources you gave me definitely touch on both sides of the debate.
It's a complex issue.
So we'll be exploring a range of perspectives and looking at what a balanced approach might look like.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Okay, so we're back, and we're still exploring all things Alberta agriculture.
Still diving deep.
Before we got into, the specifics of soil health and tilling and all that, we mentioned that Alberta has the second highest number of farms in Canada.
Right.
And I was kind of curious about, is that number going up or down? Are there more farms now than there used to be?
That's interesting. It actually ties into a bigger trend. While Alberta still has a ton of farms, the actual number went down between 2011 and 2016.
Really? So fewer farms?
Fewer, but bigger. It's happening all over Canada, not just in Alberta.
So like those giant farms you see driving across the prairies?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, those large-scale operations.
So does that mean the, small family farm is disappearing?
Not necessarily. There's still a huge variety in Alberta agriculture.
Oh, good.
The infographic, the one you've got there,
Yep.
It shows all the different types of farms.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
You've got everything from massive cattle ranches to smaller, more specialized operations,
Okay.
like greenhouses or market gardens.
So there's still room for the little guy.
For sure. Speaking of getting into farming, one of the sources you gave me had advice for people who want to start farming.
Oh, right.
And I learned that there's actually no official definition of a hobby farm.
Really? I always thought it was about, how many acres you had.
It's more about your intention. Are you doing it for fun or are you trying to make money?
Makes sense.
If you're aiming to make a profit, you're running a farm business, regardless of size.
So you could have a super small farm and still make a living from it.
Absolutely. The source even gave examples like some fruit and vegetable producers make good money from just a few acres.
Huh.
Especially if they're selling directly to consumers or using techniques like greenhouse production.
Okay, so size isn't everything. But what about the money side of things in general? Can you actually make a decent living from farming these days?
It's tough. It really depends.
On what?
All the type of farm you're running, obviously.
Right.
The markets you're selling to, the price of commodities.
Government policies?
Yeah, even things like that.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is. But one thing that's interesting is that in 2016, Alberta's agricultural sector was almost perfectly split between animal production and crop farms.
Oh, really?
Exactly 50-50.
Almost. 46% animal production and 54% crops.
Wow, that's really balanced.
It is. It shows how diverse the industry is.
Yeah.
There are lots of different paths to success in agriculture.
I remember seeing something about a fuel benefit for farmers in one of these sources.
Oh, you mean the Alberta Farm Fuel Benefit Program? Yeah, that's it. That must help a lot with expenses.
It does, but to qualify, you need to have at least $10,000 in gross annual farm production.
So you have to be a pretty serious operation.
Yeah, you can't just be growing tomatoes in your backyard.
And then there's the whole tax thing.
Ah, yes, taxes.
One source pointed out that if you're claiming income from farming, the Canada Revenue Agency considers you a farmer.
Makes sense.
But the rules are different if you're a full-time farmer versus a part-time farmer.
That's right. If you make more money off the farm than on it, you might not be able to deduct all of your farm losses.
So you can't just pretend to be a farmer to avoid paying taxes.
Nope. The government's pretty strict about that. You need to show that you're actually running a legitimate business.
That makes sense.
So farming is a business. It takes planning, management, good decision-making, and sometimes, a bit of luck.
Yeah.
Speaking of luck, one of your sources talked about the 2024 harvest season in Alberta.
Oh, yeah. How was it?
Apparently, it was a record-breaking year for harvest progress. Wow, really? They had perfect weather in August and September.
So harvest was early.
Super early, practically finished by October 22nd.
That must have been nice for the farmers.
It was, but the yields were a bit of a mixed bag.
How so?
Well, provincially, the yields were actually slightly below the 5-year average,
Oh, interesting.
but it varied a lot depending on the region.
Because of different weather patterns.
Exactly. Some areas had amazing yields, way above average,
Okay.
while others were, kind of disappointing.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a gamble, farming.
It is. You can do everything right, but ultimately you're still at the mercy of Mother Nature.
So true.
And I think that's one of the things that makes agriculture so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's this constant interplay between human ingenuity and the forces of nature.
It's a partnership.
Exactly. We've learned so much in this deep dive about the diversity of Alberta's agricultural landscape.
We have. The different types of farms, the challenges, the opportunities.
And we haven't even touched on things like livestock management or grain handling or the role of technology.
Just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly.
I feel like I'm just starting to understand all the work that goes into producing the food we eat.
And in this last part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some of the unique challenges and considerations that are specific to Alberta.
Okay, like what?
Things like soil salinity and water management.
Sounds interesting.
We'll even talk about the economics of straw.
Straw.
Yep, it's more valuable than you might think.
I'm intrigued.
We'll also look at some cutting-edge research on soil conservation and explore how farmers are adapting to climate change.
Okay, cool. So much to talk about.
Stay tuned.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into Alberta agriculture. It's been a fascinating journey so far.
It really has so many interesting things to talk about.
Before the break, you mentioned something about the economics of straw. I have to admit, that piqued my curiosity.
Yeah, straw. It's not just for animal bedding anymore.
Really, I always thought of it as like a byproduct, not something that people actually buy and sell.
You'd be surprised. One of the sources you gave me talks about how straw is actually a valuable commodity.
Huh. Who's buying all this straw?
Well, it turns out it has a lot of uses, livestock bedding, obviously.
Right.
But also things like erosion control, even as a building material.
A building material, you mean like houses?
Exactly. Straw bale construction is becoming more popular, especially for people who are interested in sustainable building.
Straw bale houses, wow. I never would have thought of that. So it's like super eco-friendly.
It can be, yeah. Straw bales are a great insulator, and they're surprisingly strong.
It's amazing how something that we often consider waste can have so much value.
It is. It's all about finding creative solutions. Speaking of challenges, we've talked a lot about the environmental side of agriculture.
Right.
But one of your sources goes into some detail about water management issues in Alberta.
Yeah, water is obviously crucial for farming.
Absolutely, especially in a province that can get pretty dry.
So what kind of water management issues are we talking about?
Well, one concern is just the overall demand for water.
From farms.
From farms, but also from cities and industry. As the population grows, the demand for water is only going to increase.
So it's like a competition for resources.
In a way, yeah. The source talks about how Alberta has a system of water licenses to try and manage this.
So farmers can't just like take as much water as they want.
Nope. They have to apply for licenses and operate within certain limits.
Which makes sense. You don't want to deplete the water supply.
Exactly. The source also mentions things like water conservation measures.
Like what?
More efficient irrigation systems, for example.
Okay.
And trying to reduce evaporation losses.
So using water more wisely.
Precisely. And speaking of challenges, we can't forget about climate change.
Right, that's a big one.
One of your sources goes into some detail about how climate change is already impacting Alberta agriculture.
Like how?
Well, it's affecting growing seasons, for one thing.
In what way?
Warmer temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns.
So it's getting harder to predict what the weather's going to be like.
Exactly. Some areas are getting more drought, while others are seeing more intense rainfall events.
That must make it really hard for farmers to plan.
It does. And it can impact crop yields and increase the risk of pest outbreaks.
It sounds like farmers are having to adapt to a whole new set of challenges.
They are, and they're doing a remarkable job.
So what are they doing?
Well, the source mentions things like developing drought-tolerant crops,
Okay.
implementing soil conservation practices, to retain moisture,
Yeah, that makes sense.
and even adjusting their planting and harvesting schedules to accommodate the changing weather pattern.
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but it's essential.
This deep dive has really made me appreciate just how complex and interconnected everything is in agriculture.
It is. It's a whole system, and everything affects everything else. And, I think the main takeaway from all of this is that Alberta agriculture is incredibly diverse and dynamic. Farmers are constantly learning, adapting, and finding new ways to improve.
It's inspiring, really.
It is. So, listener, what surprised you the most in this deep dive?
What will you be thinking about next time you sit down to a meal?
We hope this has given you a new appreciation for the food on your plate and for the hard work of Alberta farmers.
That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another topic, ready to dive deep and explore.
Until then, keep learning and keep asking questions.